the environment that I came out of, I was more used to blowing things up than saving the dolphins' ears, and this was a whole new paradigm shift that I had to go through.
Hi, and welcome to the next episode of Tell Us All About It. Today we're going to be talking about noise. Granger Bennett, who's our guest, has worked at Talis Consultants for over 7 years. He's the Noise Section Lead and provides consultancy advice to a range of mining and oil and gas clients. Prior to this, he was involved with a wide range of military research and development projects and major acquisition projects. Like me, he's got an engineering degree from Stellenbosch University in South Africa. But unlike me, he's got 2 master's degrees from the Naval Postgraduate School in the USA. And I guess some people might consider noise a little bit boring and niche, but it's anything but that, having worked with Granger for over 7 years. And Granger might be the most interesting, boring person I've ever worked with. Welcome.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for the welcome, yeah.
So I guess for the dummies around, what is noise? Can you give me a bit of a summary so that people like me can understand it a bit more?
No, sure. And I must just clarify that when we're talking about noise, we're talking about acoustics, because you do get other forms of noise. When I first arrived in Australia, it was called acoustics. And in the previous company I was working at, we deliberately changed the name to noise. Because as soon as you mention noise, your client is even asking you to do a noise assessment, and so we realigned the name of the section from the acoustics to noise. Yeah.
Okay.
Just because it becomes like a colloquial term that everybody's using and knows. When I say noise, I'm not talking about electrical noise, I'm talking about acoustic noise.
Sure. Fantastic. So how did you get into noise? I guess what drew you to this area of expertise, and when did that start?
Well, if you told me 17 years ago I'd be doing what I'm doing now, I would tell you, I'd ask you, what are you smoking? To be honest. To understand how I got involved in noise, I need to go a little bit back, if you don't mind, to where I came from and the career path that I followed initially. As you mentioned, I was in the military, in particular in the Navy, where I joined the Navy, got amazing opportunities there, got to go and study at Stellenbosch and get my engineering degree, which was electrical engineering degree. Just having electrical engineering degree as a acoustics person or noise person is quite weird in the industry, just by the way. And then I, spent time in the Navy and spent quite a long time in the Navy and got other opportunities to go and study my master's degree, which was in the USA at the Naval Postgraduate School, which was quite an amazing experience.
What were the masters in? Anything related to noise?
Yeah, so I went there to go and do electrical engineering. And then while I was there, the profs came and spoke to me and said, hey, why don't I do a dual master's? And because the subject I was pursuing in electrical engineering was digital signal processing, which is quite a sort of a very technical type of part of electrical engineering. And they said, but a lot of the work that I was doing segues quite nicely into something they called engineering acoustics. And they said, but why don't I do a dual master's in engineering acoustics? And I said, yeah, no, why not?
Yep.
See, while I'm there, I might as well have as much fun as I can. And then I started in doing electrical engineering and engineering acoustics, which I finished both. But anyhow, then I finished my master's in around about the year 2000, and then went back to South Africa and got heavily involved in a major acquisition project over there that was for submarines. where we were doing, we had the Daphne submarines, and then we were acquiring new 209 submarines. Just Daphne and 209 is a class of submarine, and got heavily involved with that. And because the stuff that I was doing for my postgraduate was very much involved with underwater acoustics.
Yep.
Submarines, as soon as you are dived, your only sensor that you got to determine what is happening on the surface is sound.
Your sonar.
The sonar, yeah. So you've got passive and active sonar, and so I was very involved with that. But I was more like a systems engineer, where I was responsible for integrating and testing a whole range of different systems. And then time marched on, and it came to a point where you have to make a decision. You've come to a segue in your career path, if I can call it that. And then my wife and I were interested in finding out what Australia was all about. And I put in my resume. And then there was a company here that took a lot of interest in my capabilities in the underwater world, underwater noise. The first thing I got involved with was with a project up on the Merritt Islands, which is north of the Mitchell Plateau. Really interesting project. But there I found out the real reason why they brought me over was to determine the impacts of underwater noise on marine fauna. And I said, what? Do you really need, is that something that you really want me to do? And so it was, and I can still remember I was in this one meeting actually with the client, and I told them, look, I'm used to the environment that I came out of. I was more used to blowing things up than saving the dolphins' ears, and this was a whole new paradigm shift that I had to go through, and so I got involved with it. It was actually really interesting to be involved in that sort of small little niche segment of acoustics, because everybody here in Australia as well was used to using acoustics, underwater noise, particularly for defense work.
Yeah.
You also had seismic surveys and bathymetric surveys that depend on acoustics, but in particular in the military, acoustics is the meaning of life and death to you. And so everybody here was trying to transfer across from this military naval perspective to impacts on marine fauna. And we didn't know in those years, in 2007, there was no set and well-defined limits, because obviously noise is very technical. It's you can measure it, and once you can measure something, then you can determine at what levels you're going to exceed a certain limit that is going to result in either hearing loss for the marine fauna or behavioral disturbance. So it was a really interesting time to be here in Australia and be involved in that industry. But I was still, it was a bit of a long journey out to travel before I really realized the impacts that we are having on marine fauna. I was still very much in my military way of thinking. Yeah. It's like, this is just like a nice to have almost, if I can call it that, doing these assessments.
Ticking a box almost.
Almost ticking a box, yeah. And then...
A bit of that still goes on, I think, sometimes.
Yeah, it does go on. But now that we've got well-defined levels, in the beginning years, you had to really provide a lot of academic papers. So we, to come up with some meaningful number to help the proponents to manage their noise underwater, you had to do a lot of research into a lot of papers. And then you start to also realize that we knew very little about the impacts of noise on marine fauna. We knew some things, but not a whole lot of stuff.
And it's interesting, just to segue, you've played to us in the office sounds from the ocean, and you can hear sort of that white noise almost of the sounds, but there's a whole suite of other things going on. There's you can obviously hear whale call and everything else, but there's all sorts of other things going on above the surface and below the surface that we wouldn't normally be aware of.
I think very few people are aware of how the noise landscape plays out in the underwater world. It's a bit like being in a submarine, and this is maybe why when I hit this turning point, which I'll come to that story a little bit later on, but when I realized, oh my word, we are having massive impacts on marine fauna. But I could relate to it because in the submarine world, your only eyes is your ears. It's the only sensor that you can determine what your tactical picture looks like on the surface.
Sure.
So you as soon as you're submerged, you're dependent on your ears and building up this picture as to what the surface looks like. And sometimes the guys can get it wrong. And you might have seen or heard of stories where submarine surfaces on top of the yacht or something like that because they didn't know it was there. That's because they're listening with their ears and they're trying to pick up this, determine this tactical picture. And it's a very complex. In a submarine, you've got a whole combat suite with about 8 to 10 people in that control room. And with the sole purpose of determining what's happening on the surface, and when you go from depth to periscope depth, that's when you've got your snorkel up, but you're not surfaced yet. You're just high enough to put your periscope out so you can see what the landscape looks like. The only person who can make that final decision is the skipper of the boat. So the XO will the first lieutenant will always come out and prepare everything, and then the skipper has to make that final decision, because it is a life or death decision. If you get it wrong, you're going to get it potentially horribly wrong. Because if a vessel goes over you, it'll potentially cut through your hull and all that sort of stuff. So for the marine fauna, and just remember they are submerged fast. Or some of them are always submerged, but like the whales and the dolphins are only coming up periodically to the surface. But they're having to do the same complex stuff that we do in a submarine to determine what the surface picture is looking like. And they're hearing the noises, but they have to determine how close that noise is to them. And it's a very, very complex decision to make. It's almost like, say, for example, you've got a blind person that's trying to walk across a field, but there's a whole lot of guys hooning around it. He'll hear the noises, but it'd be very hard for him to determine how close that noise is, or that vehicle is to where he's walking. These very complex decisions they need to make, and if they get it wrong, it's a life and death situation. A vessel can go over them. And
so in terms of the impacts that you're saying that noise has, or the anthropogenic noise has to marine fauna, what sort of impacts are we talking about? Are we talking about disruption of their bodily processes? Are we talking about disruption of the way they potentially hear sounds, or a completely different sort of impact?
So there's two things that we look. The physiological stuff is a whole discussion in and of itself, but predominantly when we're doing an assessment, we're looking at two major components. One is hearing loss. You can think of it as hearing loss, and the other one is behavioral disturbance.
Yes.
So hearing loss, if an animal's hearing gets damaged permanently, then you're actually ruining its life, if you know what I mean, because just like a submarine, once you're submerged, you can't hear what's happening around you. So it's really hard to make those determinations. Is it safe for me to surface? Then the other one is behavioral disturbance. And that goes on a masking of calls, because the way you communicate is through speaking to each other, calling to each other. And that's the only way. Imagine if you submerge, you've probably been diving before. your visibility is limited to, in good vis, you're getting about 20, 30 meters, if you're lucky, if you know what I mean. But very often the person who's trying to get hold of you, or the thing that's trying to get hold of you, is further than that. So they rely very much on their calls, especially mothers and calves, for example, in the humpback whales. They're calling each other constantly, and if the noise is too high, then that separation distance between the calf and the female needs to be close at all times. So that's the one behavioral effect. The other behavioral effect is disturbance, while during breeding season and all that sort of stuff, which can hamper population sizes.
I was going to ask you a little bit about whether there's any merit to the suggestion that mass beachings and things like that are due to sort of these impacts from a noise perspective. Is that an area that you've looked at? Yeah,
well, look here. There's it's uncertain, the mass because I think it's a bit more complex than just sound. But sound is noise has possibly got one aspect to it, and there is a correlation between use of high-powered military sonar and beach bandings. But whether that is a true correlation or not, it's really hard to definitively say it is. Whether the beachings could be for a whole number of effects, but there is some data that indicates that like especially for the high-powered military sonar, that there is a correlation there.
So you were saying that there's no real criteria set for the marine environment from a noise limit perspective. We've obviously got in WA the EP noise regulations, which prescribe noise levels for various receptors. Is there a commensurate sort of framework for the marine environment which minimises some of these risks and impacts?
Yeah, so in 2007 when I started, there was nothing. It was you're building basically from scratch, and then move all the way forward to 2024, and now we've got internationally recognized levels that we can do our assessments against. So it's a completely different a landscape out there in terms of our knowledge as to how noise impacts marine fauna. So we definitely have got these levels. Interestingly, most of the research has been done on whales and dolphins.
So your cetacean type
things, but very little has been done on turtles. Quite a bit has been done on fish. So there still is major gaps, but compared to where we were to where we are now, there is a lot more information, and there's definitely levels that metrics that we can now follow in our assessments to determine what the impacts are likely going to be.
So you joined Talis, 2017, I would have thought?
End of 2016.
2017, okay. That decision was obviously a big one, and obviously you brought a few people with you in terms of the noise section that you were able to set up at Talis. What sort of work have you done at Talis that I guess has progressed through that, and what are the things you're working on at the moment?
So the noise work we do, noise is very diverse in the type of where you can apply your knowledge. So we've done environmental impact assessments, environmental modeling, as well as monitoring. We've done occupational stuff, so we do occupational noise surveys. We do whole body vibration surveys. We do public address and general alarm stuff.
And this is all both terrestrial and marine?
Yes. So on the marine side, it's underwater noise impacts on marine fauna. We have done some work for divers as well.
Okay.
But predominantly the underwater noise work is on marine fauna, doing those impact assessments, environmental impact assessments, and then also measurement. when they start their operations. How loud is it actually compared to the model?
And what sort of, techniques are you using? I mean, I imagine the technology has improved substantially from when you first started in the field. Can you talk us through a little bit about some of the techniques you might use, whether it's different in the mining sector compared to the oil and gas sector, compared to land development, or even different environments, say working in Perth versus working up in the Pilbara?
Over the last even if you look at the technology changes over the last 10 years, they've been huge. I did a bit of a summary of that, but we forget how big the technology changes are, because you're so immersed in the technology, you don't realize how significant and rapidly it's changing. But it is changing pretty rapidly. In our section, we've tried to sort of keep pace and use technology to our advantage. And when I say our advantage, that's to be able to deliver to the client a far better product, that's got a lot more detail to it, that has got, well thought out approaches to solving their problems.
I'd expect nothing less from you.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And that has also forced us along this pathway of realizing if a miner or if somebody in the industry wants to really curtail their noise impacts and really understand their noise impacts on the communities that are surrounding them, they need to have technology at their site, and that helps the boots on the ground. The people. The only people on a mine site that can, for example, and this is also for refineries and other industries, that can really change the noise impacts in the operational sense, is your mine planners. It is your dispatchers, the guys who manage your fleet for you. Those are the guys that are right at the coalface, that can make those changes to the site operationally to reduce their noise impacts on the communities in real time. And then obviously at the enviros on site, they need to be able to respond really, really quickly to a complaint. And that's sort of forced our section. We've gone and realized that this is, if you really are wanting to make a difference in terms of, your noise impacts on a community, and to really help the guys, the boots on the ground, to actually make that determination, they need a tool that can help them, because noise is complex. I'm talking decibels, I'm talking dBAs, and then dBZs and dBCs, and what is a dB in any case?
Absolutely.
You give them these small numbers and you say that's really a big number. And
it's not a straightforward scale. This sounds like exactly. It's an interesting segue into a topic I was going to talk to you about is Nexus.
Yes.
Which I find fascinating. This tool, the Nexus, as you've called her, and you do anthropomorphize this technology.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about Nexus and what this tool does.
Yeah, look, I can talk about Nexus for hours.
I know.
I won't bore you with that. But it's basically, we realized within Talis Noise Section is that to help your miners and your clients to really be able to make a difference in the communities, in an operational sense, we needed some technology that would take noise right to the guys at the coalface, the boots on the ground. So we came up with the idea of a real-time system that can integrate all these different data sets, because like I mentioned previously, technology has grown in leaps and bounds just over the last 10 years. And now what you can do in 2024 is different to what you could do in 2015. So we realized if we can harness all these data sets, these large data sets, which people now have, that's data sets that include fleet management system data, forecast weather, live weather, SCADA data, monitoring data. And if we can combine all those data sets into one platform and add onto that a predictive capability, and then also create a user interface that is really, really simple for normal boots on the ground guys who are already under a lot of pressure from their just normal day-to-day job.
Like engineers, we need it very simple.
Need it very simple, yeah. We decided we wanted to progress that. That's what our vision was, to actually bring it, noise management right down to the boots on the ground. So
which is where the decisions are made.
Yeah. And then so that resulted in us creating Nexus, and it also resulted in us creating Vanguard Technologies, because the way that you handle technology versus consulting is two different business models. And anyhow, we've now realized Nexus now exists, being used
by a whole suite of different companies in Australia, but also around the world is being looked at as well.
Yeah, it's quite exciting to see how it's, the visualization and the capabilities helping miners and ports and refineries to understand what their true noise impacts are and how to make changes to there.
Excellent. So Nexus it's essentially a real-time modelling system. Yeah, a predictor. So takes everything in. A model is only as good as its data. It takes everything in, and you can feed it whatever you want to feed it.
Yes.
And it can predict how quickly does it predict into the future? How far into the future can it predict? Is it seconds? Is it minutes? Is it hours? And how quickly does it do that?
Yeah. So using the Nexus is divided up into two tools: the planning tool, and then the execute, which is the real-time tool. The planning tool helps miners to take a look into the far future, the 20 and 30-year mine plans, all the way through to the 3-year mine plan, all the way through to the 2-week plan or weekly plan, all the way through to the next 24 hours. So, it can help them understand their risks way into the future, right up until the next 24 hours, which is the next shift. And then that information gets handed over to execute, which is getting the live data. Yep. And then it's looking a little bit into the future, normally about 15 minutes into the future, but it uses the live data that's coming in to update itself. And the speed at which we can do it on the live system, every second we can make and I don't call it a modeling tool, I call it a predictive tool, just because it's a modeling software helps you to do some things that Nexus doesn't really do, if you know what I mean. But it's a predictive tool. It uses all this data to be able to make a prediction and then to visualize it. And the visualization is really, really powerful because it helps people to understand, okay, this is what the noise impacts are, and then it also gives them guidance as to how to.
In terms of, I guess, that less noisy question, we've obviously talked about a little bit about the noise regulations, and they're about receptors, but where you're dealing with traditional owners who have values and beliefs that aren't necessarily aligned with ours, for example, hunting grounds, mythological grounds, ethnographic concerns, how do you go about quantifying limits for those sort of environments that might not necessarily align with our traditional views of what an impact might be?
Yeah, it's a good question. Social surrounds has become a bigger and bigger issue over the last couple of years. We've had the privilege of working with a lot of the traditional owners to help them understand noise and also to help us understand what is important to them. That they've got, when they're using their country, if you know what I mean, it's they've got certain things that they want to carry on doing within their country. And the biggest thing is that those activities which they're wanting to do actually don't fall under the regulation.
Yes.
So it's not something that you can say, okay, you're now exceeding a certain level according to the regulation. It's like, okay, what level is acceptable and not acceptable? So we had to do a lot of work, in understanding, first of all, going back to first principles of really understanding the traditional owners, and a little bit more about their culture and how they do things. And then using the knowledge that we do have in terms of audibility and when noise becomes a nuisance noise, we've tried to come up with some levels to give guidance to the some of our clients as to how, first of all, if they go over a certain level, then they need to change something or do something, and be able to give them some guidance as to, okay, if the traditional owners want to use this part of land, then maybe do this and this and this to prevent or to keep the levels within an acceptable level for the traditional owners when they're making use of that.
So is that an amenity question, do you think? What they've had in the past versus what they're being exposed to or potentially being exposed to is a question, I guess, around amenity.
Yeah, I think there's amenity, but then also because they're very connected to the land itself.
Yes.
And the land includes animals and fauna and flora.
But also the mythological values as well, which is interesting.
Yeah, the mythological values are very interesting and very hard, I think, for us to fully understand and comprehend.
Is there a common misconception or myth about noise you'd like to see addressed or debunked, do you think?
Yeah, well, this was part of my my transformation from my previous job that I was involved with. But there is a huge misconception amongst the vast majority of the population that that noise is not harmful, and I'm not talking about occupational noise. I'm just talking about a normal environmental noise. We've got this tenacity because we live in such an urban environment that we suppress the impacts of noise on our system. There is definitely physiological effects, psychological effects, and other effects from noise on you as a person. And because we are suppressing it on a day-to-day basis, it's we even are totally unaware of it. And if you go and look at the World Health Organization, they estimate, and this is now looking at the science of the physiology of noise on your body, is that, and that's industrial, like cars and trucks and trains and aeroplanes and industrial noise sources. And they've worked out that just due to roads alone, it's wiping off 1 million in Europe, 1 million life years every year of
the population. The
population, yeah. And so I started to wonder, but how is this even possible? I look at that and I think, no, these guys are smoking something.
Yeah.
And but it does go down to the physiological level, and I started to become more and more aware of this, especially if I was working late into the night in the office, and you got the air conditioning unit that's going the whole time, and then in a lot of offices it will switch off at 9 o'clock. And I still remember on a number of occasions that you'd be working away, and then all of a sudden the aircon would switch off and you go dead quiet, and there's this sense of relief. It's
it's quite noticeable. I mean, even when you've got traffic coming past on a quiet morning, and traffic's coming past, and then suddenly it stops. You feel yourself decompress. And I note your point earlier just about sort of that constant barrage of noise that we suppress. I was watching something or listening to something or reading something. New York, their daytime background noise is the same level as a constant scream in terms of decibels.
Yeah.
So having to deal with that on a constant basis, it's quite astounding.
Now, the interesting thing is that when you feel that sense of relief or peace almost, what you don't realize is when you're exposing yourself to these sources, you're actually, your body, and you've got no control over it. No matter how much control you think you've got over your body, when it releases cortisone, you've got no control over it. So that's your fight and flight hormone.
Yes.
And what you're feeling is that your body's under this constant stress. And it's only when you remove that stress that you feel that you got that feeling of peace and almost well-being. It's because all of a sudden your body realizes, oh, no, I don't have to be stressed out anymore. And it's all happening on the subconscious level. You're not even really aware of it until it
actually occurs.
Yeah.
So you're advocating vacations away from noise. Is that something that, I guess, in terms of how we should be treating noise as individuals, getting away from it, obviously going out into the country is a huge opportunity for us, particularly where we are at the moment in WA. But is that something that you would advocate as part of our well-being?
Okay, now a really good question is you must realize that not all noise is bad noise. Okay, so you've got, and this is my terminology, I class it as good noise and bad noise. And so that's why I emphasize this industrial noise. Industrial noise, that includes aeroplanes, cars, machines going and trucks moving past you and all that sort of stuff. So if I had to go and take a measurement of the cars outside or of the air conditioning unit, I'd be getting maybe in the 50s, somewhere around here.
dBA.
Now, if I took dBA, yeah. Now, if I had to go down to the beach, I'd be measuring 50, 55 if the waves are coming in.
But that's not anthropogenic noise.
No, but it's the same level. But it's actually, they've proven that, and you probably felt this when you're down at the beach and you got these waves coming in and even crashing and all that sort of stuff. It's actually therapeutic to you, because the speed at which the wave is coming in is very similar to your breathing. So it falls into sync, and it's actually good for you. Another thing, if you go into the rainforest and you hear all the birds tweeting and all that sort of stuff, if I had to go and measure it, it would be over 50.
Yes.
But it's not being, in fact, they recommend, and this is maybe instead of taking your short vacation, but if you listen to bird sound
and bird song,
20 minutes a day, it's actually good for your health.
Fantastic.
So maybe that's something you can take away from this. Listen to more bird song.
Well, I did read something the other day as well that when birds wake up in the morning, and obviously there's just this mass of the dawn chorus. There's some hypothesis that this is the birds actually talking to other birds and saying, "Hey, I'm awake. I've made it through the night. I'm still here." So maybe that's what music and noise and nice noise, as opposed to bad noise, is. It's our way of saying we're actually still here as a species or as an individual. And I think that's a good way of perhaps drawing this conversation to a close, that we're still here.
We're still singing.
We're still singing, and we're still making good art in whichever way we want to. So look, thank you very much, Granger. I really appreciate it. And hopefully all of our listeners were a little bit more enlightened by what you had to say today. That was really good. Thank you.
Thank you.